In 2009, a crew waded into a dying river in the Oregon high desert and built 76 fake beaver dams out of nothing but wooden posts and woven sticks. They had no beavers, no machinery, no multi-million-dollar engineering plan, just a cheap hydraulic post pounder, a stack of willow branches, and a theory that most scientists at the time thought was reckless. What happened over the next 4 years didn't just save one river. It quietly rewrote the rulebook on how humans repair broken ecosystems, and almost nobody outside a small circle of biologists knew it was happening. This is the story of what occurred when a handful of researchers stopped trying to control nature and instead tricked it into healing itself. There is a stretch of land in north-central Oregon where the rivers don't look like rivers anymore. They look like wounds. Cut deep and narrow into the desert floor, walled in by dirt banks taller than a person, the water rushes through in a thin, fast, lifeless ribbon, completely disconnected from the land around it. This is what's known as an incised stream, a channel that has carved itself so far down into the earth that it no longer floods, no longer spreads, no longer feeds the soil beside it. And one of these wounded waterways was called Bridge Creek. By the early 2000s, Bridge Creek was, by almost every ecological measure, dying. But here's what almost nobody outside the world of stream ecology understood at the time. Bridge Creek wasn't just another tired desert stream. It was part of the John Day Basin, home to one of the last wild undammed river systems in the Pacific Northwest, and it carried a population of steelhead trout listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, a species hanging on by a thread in a stream that was actively, slowly killing the conditions it needed to survive. The clock was running. And the standard fix? Heavy machinery, concrete structures, channel reshaping that costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars per mile, wasn't coming. Not for a creek this remote, this overlooked, this far from anyone's headline. So a small group of researchers asked a different question, not how do we rebuild this river, but what built rivers like this in the first place before we destroyed the thing that did it? The answer was beavers. And that answer mattered more than it might sound, because what most people don't realize is just how thoroughly North America was once shaped by this one animal. Before European fur trappers arrived, scientists estimate that up to 250 million beaver ponds once dotted the continent. Enough impounded water, by some calculations, to submerge the entire states of Washington, Oregon, and California. When Lewis and Clark moved through the Missouri River Basin in 1805, they described beaver dams extending up every stream as far as they could see. The rich farmland of the northern half of the continent exists in part because beavers spent thousands of years trapping sediment behind their dams. This wasn't a side character in the story of the American landscape. This was one of its primary architects. And then the fur trade arrived and erased it. Trappers killed beavers by the millions for felted hats sold across Europe. Populations that may have once numbered in the hundreds of millions collapsed to as few as 100,000 animals continent-wide. When the beavers vanished, their dams collapsed and washed away one by one. Wetlands dried into dust. Streams that had once been wide, slow, sprawling mosaics of ponds and channels narrowed into single, angry threads of water that cut downward instead of spreading outward. The land hadn't just lost an animal, it had lost its plumbing system. And nobody, for 2 centuries, fully grasped what the loss had actually cost. By the time Michael Pollock, a biologist who'd spent years studying the connection between beavers and salmon in Alaska, turned his attention to Bridge Creek, he had a hunch that sounded almost too simple to be real. He'd already shown in earlier research that even short-lived collapsing beaver dams trapped meaningful amounts of sediment before they failed. So his logic went like this. If a dam that only lasts a season can still do good work, what would happen if you built dams that didn't fail? What if, instead of waiting for beavers to repopulate a dead stream on their own, which could take decades if it happened at all, you gave them a head start, not a replacement for beavers, a scaffold, something to lean on while the ecosystem caught up? To most of the salmon biology establishment, this sounded like madness, and not a quiet kind of skepticism, an active, vocal one. The fear was specific and reasonable on paper. Pile up artificial dams in a stream, and you risk burying critical spawning habitat under silt. You risk turning flowing, oxygenated water into stagnant, sun-baked ponds that cook young fish alive in the summer heat. Nobody really understood it, Pollock would later recall, with the kind of laugh that comes from having been doubted and proven right. But in 2009, doubt it or not, he and his colleague Nick Bowes decided to test the idea at a scale nobody had attempted before. There was just one problem. When they asked engineering firms to quote them on building artificial beaver dam structures, the number that came back was $50,000 per dam for a project that would eventually need over 100 of them. Bowes was, in his own words, appalled. He'd built an entire log home for that price. So instead of hiring contractors, he went looking for a workaround, and he found one, a hydraulic post pounder, a machine that looks something like a cross between a jackhammer and a bazooka. designed to drive fence posts into hard ground. It was never built for river restoration. But Bowes realized it could drive wooden posts straight into a stream bed in a fraction of the time, and at a fraction of the cost of anything an engineering firm could offer. And this is where the project stopped being theoretical and became physical. In 2009, the team pounded posts into 3.4 kilometers of Bridge Creek, then wove willow branches between them by hand, the same technique almost that a beaver itself might use, except executed by exhausted humans instead of teeth and tails. 76 structures built not to look impressive, not to be permanent monuments, but to do one single job: slow the water down just enough that nature might recognize an opportunity and take it. "My back still hurts," Bowes joked years later. It wasn't engineering in the traditional sense. It was something closer to an invitation. Then they did the hardest part of any experiment like this. They stepped back, and they waited. What happened next is the part of this story that even the scientists who designed the project didn't fully expect. The wild beavers already living in fragments along Bridge Creek didn't ignore the new structures. They didn't treat them as foreign objects to rout around. They moved in on them almost immediately, reinforcing weak points with mud and sticks, rebuilding sections that had washed loose, expanding the structures the humans had built into something larger and more complex than the original design. The artificial dams weren't replacing beaver behavior. They were triggering it, giving animals that had been struggling with a habitat too degraded to support real dam building suddenly something stable enough to build on top of. Within a remarkably short window, the team added 45 more structures between 2010 and 2012, partly because the original 76 were working so well that beavers kept colonizing new sections of stream, and the researchers wanted to keep pace with them. Read that timeline again, because it matters. This wasn't a 10-year slow burn. This was a feedback loop that started accelerating almost the moment it began. And then the numbers started coming in, and they were not subtle. Beaver dam building activity across Bridge Creek increased eightfold. 8 times more dam construction than before the intervention began. Not built by machines, but by the animals. The machines had simply given a reason to stay. Some of the original artificial structures captured so much sediment that they became completely interred, buried in the very material they were designed to trap, exactly as intended. And here's the detail that should stop you cold if you understand how slowly geology usually moves. The streambed itself, the physical floor of Bridge Creek, began climbing. Like a plant reaching for sunlight, the channel started rising out of the deep incision trench it had carved over decades, spilling water sideways onto the floodplain it had been cut off from for generations. The creek's submerged surface area tripled. Side channels, the braided, complex network of smaller waterways that healthy streams naturally develop, grew by more than 1,200%. Nick Bowes put it plainly. Habitat changes that we thought would take a decade happened in 1 to 3 years. Think about what that actually means. Decades of expected recovery time, compressed into a window you could measure in single-digit years, achieved with sticks, mud, and a fence post machine that cost a tiny fraction of what a single engineered concrete structure would have run. But a healthier stream is only half the story because the entire point of this experiment was never really about water. It was about the threatened steelhead trout whose survival was tied to that water. This is where the data stops being interesting and starts being undeniable. Following the installation of the beaver dam analogues, juvenile steelhead density, survival, and overall production all rose sharply, without disrupting the fish's ability to migrate upstream or downstream, the exact outcome the original skeptics had feared most. Bridge Creek began producing nearly 3 times more fish than a nearby control stream where no structures had been installed. Young steelhead survival jumped 52% compared to that untouched control watershed, and within just 4 years of the first structures going in, researchers recorded a 175% increase in juvenile steelhead production relative to the stream that had been left alone. This wasn't a hopeful field note scribbled in someone's notebook. This became one of the most cited watershed-scale restoration experiments in modern stream ecology, published in 2016 in Scientific Reports, built on an 8-year before and after comparison study with tens of thousands of individually tagged fish tracked through the system. A follow-up study published the next year examined temperature data across more than 20 monitoring points along the stream and found that the dams and the ponds behind them were doing something nobody had confidently predicted, buffering dangerous spikes in water temperature, likely by pushing water underground long enough to cool before it resurfaced, directly contradicting the original fear that artificial dams would simply bake young fish alive in stagnant pools. So why does this matter beyond one creek in Oregon? Because here's where the story stops, being about a single successful experiment, and starts becoming something closer to a quiet, accelerating movement that most people have never heard of. The technique born on Bridge Creek now has a name in the restoration world: low-tech process-based restoration, or LTPBR for short. A deliberately unglamorous label for an idea that is anything but. The premise is almost philosophically different from how humans usually approach environmental repair. Traditional restoration tries to engineer a finished result. Dig the channel here, place the boulders there, plant the vegetation in this configuration, and declare the job complete. Low-tech process-based restoration does something stranger. It doesn't try to build the final outcome at all. It tries to restart a process and then get out of the way, trusting the system itself, water, sediment, willows, and eventually the animals that depend on all three, to finish the job better than any blueprint could. And once you understand that distinction, you start seeing this approach showing up in places that have nothing to do with steelhead trout, and everything to do with crises most people associate with completely different headlines. Consider Colorado in the aftermath of two of the most destructive wildfires the state has ever recorded. The Cameron Peak and East Troublesome Fires of 2020, which together burned more than 620 square miles of forest, feeding the watersheds that supply drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people along the Front Range. After a fire, that severe burned soil loses much of its ability to absorb water. Rain and snowmelt no longer soak in. They rush downhill instead, dragging ash, sediment, carbon, and nitrogen straight into the rivers that cities depend on for clean water. With the beaver populations and natural dams that once would have intercepted their runoff long gone from many of these watersheds, scientists working with the U.S. Forest Service turned to the exact same low-tech structures pioneered on Bridge Creek, hand-built wooden dams modeled directly on beaver behavior, and began deploying them through the burned terrain, hoping to slow the post-fire flood of debris before it reached the reservoirs and treatment plants downstream. One researcher involved in the project, biogeochemist Chuck Rhodes, made an observation that echoes exactly what happened in Oregon over a decade earlier. In at least one site, a wild beaver had already moved in after the artificial dam went up, drawn by willow growth the structure itself had encouraged. If you kickstart it by making these dams, Rhodes said, it may become a better beaver habitat. The machine, in other words, was building its own replacement. This is not a coincidence, and it's not chaos. This is a pattern repeating itself, watershed after watershed, almost exactly as it did the first time. And it's spreading faster than most environmental success stories ever do, because the entry cost is so low that almost anyone can participate. By 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and its partners had installed more than 100 beaver dam analog sites across the American West as part of an initiative bluntly named Leave It to Beaver. And the documented results read like a checklist of everything a degraded watershed desperately needs. Groundwater tables raised by more than 12 inches in some sites, streamside vegetation restored by a third, more than 1,000 feet of channelized stream reconnected to its natural floodplain in just a few years. In Utah's Price River, a struggling waterway running straight through the town of Helper, wildlife officials translocated nuisance beavers removed from other properties and combined that effort with constructed dam structures. 6 years later, a local newspaper column credited the project with helping save the town itself. Along another stretch of river in the same drainage, a single natural flood that drew beavers back into the area increased riparian habitat along that stretch by 230%. In Montana, biologists are now pushing the state to approve large-scale beaver relocation programs, arguing, in the words of one wildlife official, that there is simply no equivalent for what this one species does to a landscape. Not technology, not funding, not human labor at any price point. In Washington's Chehalis Basin, researchers are now using predictive modeling to identify which exact stretches of stream have the highest beaver intrinsic potential before they even build a single structure, treating the placement of fake dams less like guesswork and more like precision habitat engineering. But here's where the story gets more complicated than a simple triumph, because if this technique were a flawless miracle, every degraded river in the world would already be lined with stick-and-mud structures, and it isn't. The same low-cost, low-permitting advantage that makes these dams so appealing also makes them legally and politically tangled in ways that have nothing to do with ecology, and everything to do with one of the oldest sources of conflict in the American West, water rights. In Wyoming, a ranch manager who wanted to install just 10 of these structures along the Little Popo Aggie River found his project stalled for an entire year because state officials determined that any water temporarily held back behind the dams, even water designed only to be delayed, never permanently captured, legally required him to secure separate water rights before construction could even begin. Even after he cleared that hurdle, the state still forbade any structure wider than the stream itself or taller than its banks, which quietly limited exactly how much floodplain reconnection the project could ever achieve. Multiply that single case across the dozens of jurisdictions, water districts, and competing agricultural users throughout the arid West, and you start to see the real obstacle facing this entire movement. It was never really about whether the science works. The science, at this point, is hard to argue with. It's about whether a legal and political system built around a completely different model of water ownership can adapt fast enough to let nature's own infrastructure operate at the scale the crisis actually demands. And there's a second complication, quieter but just as important. These structures are not magic, and they are not universal. A peer-reviewed comparison of 65 separate low-tech restoration projects across the western United States found that outcomes vary significantly depending on local rainfall, the physical characteristics of the stream, and how the structures are placed, meaning the spectacular results from Bridge Creek don't automatically transfer to every drought-stricken creek in a different climate or geology. In some western Montana sites, researchers found that the structures held up fine, but simply couldn't compensate for reaches running completely dry during severe drought. In a Utah headwater stream, one study found no measurable difference in adult trout numbers between treated and untreated sites at all. The scientists who pioneered this approach are themselves the first to caution against treating it as a universal fix, rather than a tool that depends heavily on the right conditions, the right location, and ongoing maintenance that beaver believers admit doesn't simply end once the structures go in the ground. So, where does that leave the story? More than 15 years after 76 wooden posts were pounded into an Oregon creek bed by two researchers who'd just been quoted $50,000 per structure and decided to build their own machine instead. It leaves us with a genuinely strange and still unfolding question about how environmental restoration should work going forward. For more than a century, the dominant instinct in conservation has been control. Engineer the outcome you want, build the structure that produces it, manage every variable until the result matches the blueprint. Bridge Creek suggested something almost uncomfortable to that worldview, that sometimes the most sophisticated possible intervention is not a more advanced piece of engineering, but a deliberately incomplete one. A structure built to fail in exactly the right way, handing its job off to an animal that has spent millions of years perfecting techniques no human design team has ever matched. As one observer of the project put it, sometimes the most powerful engineering system on Earth isn't built by humans at all. It's built by nature, the moment we stop getting in its way. But that idea is now colliding with limits nobody fully understands yet. Climate models project a future of less snowpack and more erratic precipitation across the same western landscapes where this technique has shown its strongest results, which means the water these structures depend on to function may itself become less reliable in exactly the places that need restoration the most. Water law across a dozen states was never written with beaver mimicry in mind, and rewriting it state by state, water district by water district, could take longer than the ecosystems in question have left. And the animal at the center of this entire strategy, the beaver itself, remains, after everything, a wild creature that doesn't always cooperate with anyone's plan. It may colonize a carefully engineered structure within weeks, the way it did on Bridge Creek, or it may ignore it entirely, build somewhere unexpected, abandon a site researchers spent months designing. Scientists studying these projects describe that unpredictability not as a flaw in the experiment, but as the actual test, proof of whether a restored floodplain is functioning as genuine habitat or merely as a human idea of what habitat should look like. What happens when a strategy this cheap, this effective, and this dependent on an animal nobody fully controls runs head-on into a legal and political system built for an entirely different century? What happens to the rivers still waiting, the ones nobody has reached yet, as droughts deepen and wildfires burn hotter across exactly the watersheds where this technique has proven it can work? And what does it say about everything else we think we understand about fixing broken ecosystems, that one of the most effective tools discovered in the last 20 years of restoration science was not a new invention at all, but a 50-million-year-old animal finally given back the conditions to do what it was already built to do? Bridge Creek answered one question. It opened 100 more. And right now, in watersheds across the American West, the experiment is still running.